I still remember the exact sound the porcelain lobby floor made right before my life changed forever. It was 8:40 on a rainy Tuesday morning, and I was clutching a scalding dark roast, running on 3 hours of sleep after sitting by my mother's bedside at the clinic. My shoe caught the slick brass trim near the executive elevators. I stumbled forward. The coffee took flight, splashing dark and heavy across the pristine, tailored ivory suit of the most feared woman in the company, our CEO, Diana Vance. The entire lobby went dead silent. 50 people stopped breathing. My heart sank straight into my stomach. I was already calculating how few days we had left before our savings ran dry. I braced for the cold, public humiliation I knew was coming. Instead, Diana took a slow step forward. Her fingers gripped the lapels of my coat, pulling me downward until my chest brushed hers and I could smell the sharp notes of cedar and jasmine in her perfume. Her gaze locked onto mine, fierce and unreadable. In a low, steady whisper that sent a shiver straight through me, she said, "You just ruined my favorite suit, where's my kiss?" The silence that followed in the lobby was suffocating. Diana didn't wait for an answer. She simply released my coat, turned on her heel with razor-sharp composure, and said 3 quiet words that cut through the frozen crowd, "My office." Now. My legs felt hollow as I followed her into the private executive elevator. The doors sealed shut, locking out the staring eyes of 50 colleagues, and the cabin rose in heavy, pressurized silence. 45 floors of city skyline streaked past in the rain. I kept staring at the dark brown stain blooming across the back of her designer jacket, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When we stepped into her corner office, a vast, quiet sanctuary of smoked glass, dark walnut, and polished steel, she didn't yell. She didn't call human resources. Instead, she unbuttoned the ruined ivory blazer, tossed it unceremoniously onto a leather sofa, and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beneath the tailored shell of the fierce CEO everyone feared, she looked suddenly, strikingly exhausted. "Sit down, Owen," she said softly, not turning around. I swallowed the lump in my throat, remaining near the threshold. "Ms. Vance, I can pay for the dry cleaning. Or replace it. I know that's not enough, but please. I need this job. My mother's treatments." "I know about your mother," she interrupted, turning to face me. Her dark eyes were sharp, yet devoid of anger. "And I don't care about a piece of silk." I blinked, completely thrown off balance. Then, what was that downstairs? A faint, self-deprecating smile touched the corner of her lips. That was me buying time in front of 3 board members who were watching from the mezzanine. She walked over to her desk and slid a heavy manila folder toward the edge. "My grandfather's original charter contains an archaic succession clause," she explained, her voice dropping into a low, steady cadence. "To assume full voting control of the family trust on my 32nd birthday, I have to be in a committed, publicly announced engagement. The deadline is 2 weeks from Friday." She rested her palms on the mahogany desk, leaning slightly toward me. "The board wants to force my hand. They've lined up an arrogant corporate merger partner who intends to liquidate our manufacturing division, the same division where 500 working-class families earn their living. If I don't present a fiancé of my own choosing, they take my grandfather's company." "And you picked the guy who just poured boiling coffee over you?" I asked, bewildered. "I picked you because you're the only person in this building who doesn't look at me with calculation," Diana said quietly, her gaze softening. 3 months ago, during the late-night storm when the lower levels flooded, you stayed until 3 in the morning helping the maintenance crew haul out equipment so they wouldn't lose their overtime pay. You didn't know I was watching from the security feed." She opened the folder, revealing a legal agreement alongside a signed check that made my breath catch in my chest, an amount large enough to pay off every single medical debt my mother had accumulated, with enough left over to secure her care for years. "Be my fiancé for 6 months, Diana whispered, stepping around the desk until she was standing inches away, her scent of cedar and jasmine filling the space between us. Play the part in front of the cameras. Help me save this company, and I will make sure your family never struggles again. For the next 10 days, the 45th floor became our private theater. Every evening after the office cleared out, the heavy glass doors locked, and Diana and I sat side by side, building a fabricated history from scratch. We had to memorize the small, invisible details that convince people two souls are intertwined: our supposed first anniversary, how I took my tea, what made her laugh, and the exact shade of green my mother painted the kitchen in our old childhood home. "All right, let's run it again," Diana said on our fourth night, tossing a stack of cue cards onto her desk. She had shed her usual tailored blazer, her silk shirt rolled up at the forearms, dark strands of hair escaping her neat bun. "Where did we first meet?" "At an independent bookstore off Elm Street," I replied smoothly, leaning back against the edge of the mahogany table. "You were reaching for a rare edition of architectural history on the top shelf, and I pulled it down before it fell on you." Diana raised an eyebrow, a teasing smirk tugging at her mouth. "A bit cliché, don't you think? Why not tell them the truth? That you tried to baptize me in 90-degree dark roast to get my attention?" "Because," I retorted, matching her smile, "spilling coffee on a billionaire makes me look clumsy. Saving you from falling books makes me look dashing." "Dashing?" She let out a soft, genuine laugh, a sound so musical and unpracticed it caught me completely off guard. "Owen, you trip over your own shoelaces at least twice a week. Only when you're staring at me with that terrifying CEO scowl." "I do not scowl," she protested, stepping closer to adjust the knot of my necktie. Her fingers brushed against the skin of my throat, warm and surprisingly gentle. The teasing atmosphere instantly thickened into something heavy, electric, and entirely unscripted. Neither of us moved. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady patter of rain against the panoramic windows and the quiet cadence of her breath. She looked down at her hands on my collar, her smile fading into a quiet, wistful expression. Slowly, she stepped back, walking toward the window to watch the endless sea of city lights below. "You know," she whispered, her voice stripped bare of corporate armor, "in this entire city of 8 million people, you're the first person in 5 years who hasn't asked me for money, influence, or a board seat." I walked over, standing just behind her shoulder so she wouldn't feel cornered. "You carry the weight of 500 families on your shoulders, Diana. It's okay to put the shield down." She looked at my reflection in the glass, her dark eyes glistening with an ache she had clearly kept buried for years. "When my father passed, everyone told me I had to be made of stone. If I showed an ounce of weakness, the board would tear this legacy apart." I forgot what it felt like to just sit in a room with someone and exist without guarding my back. I watched the subtle tremor in her hands as she reached up to wipe away a stray tear before it could fall. In that quiet midnight office, surrounded by millions of dollars of glass and steel, I didn't see an untouchable executive anymore. I saw a brilliant, fiercely loyal woman who had been starved of genuine affection for far too long. And standing beside her in the dim light, my heart tightened with a dangerous, unspoken truth: I was no longer acting. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a sea of shimmering silk, crystal chandeliers, and predatory smiles. Every camera in the room was pointed directly at us. Diana was breathtaking in a midnight blue gown, her arm linked naturally through mine. For the press and the board, we played our parts with effortless grace. She laughed at my quiet quips, I kept a steady, protective hand at the small of her back, and together we presented an unbreakable front. But as the classical quartet swelled and the suffocating weight of 300 socialites closed in, I saw Diana's jaw tighten. Beneath the poise, she was drowning. Without a word, I guided her away from the reporters, slipping through a set of French doors out onto the grand stone terrace. The cool night air hit us like cold water. The city lights stretched out beneath a gentle, misting rain, washing away the oppressive perfume and fake laughter of the ballroom behind us. Diana leaned against the stone balustrade, closing her eyes and exhaling a long, trembling breath. The mist clung to her dark hair, sparkling like diamonds under the terrace lamps. "You handled them perfectly," I said, shrugging off my tuxedo jacket and gently draping it over her bare shoulders. Even the senior partners looked convinced. She pulled the heavy wool around herself, inhaling the scent of my collar. "They weren't just convinced by the script, Owen." She turned to face me, her dark eyes reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers through the glass. "They were convinced because I wasn't acting tonight." My breath caught in my throat. "Diana. I've spent years believing that everyone around me was just waiting for me to fail," she whispered, stepping closer until only an inch of rain-scented air separated us. "When you stand beside me, I don't feel like a target. I feel safe. And that terrifies me, because when this contract ends..." Her voice broke slightly, her fingers curling into the fabric of my lapels, echoing the morning we first collided. "I don't know how I'm supposed to walk back into an empty room." I couldn't hold back the truth any longer. I reached up, my hand trembling slightly as my fingers brushed a damp lock of hair from her cheek. "Then don't let it end," I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. "I stopped following the script weeks ago, Diana. It's always been real for me." Diana looked up into my eyes, her breath hitching, and in that quiet, rain-soaked moment, the entire world vanished. She rose onto her toes, sliding her hands around the back of my neck, and pulled me down into a kiss. It wasn't the polite, scripted kiss of a fake engagement. It was desperate, tender, and deeply honest, a promise spoken without words in the midnight mist. If you've ever found yourself falling for someone you were never supposed to love, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more of these heartfelt stories to life. We pulled apart slowly, our foreheads resting together as our breaths mingled in the cold air. Diana gave me the first completely unburdened, beautiful smile I had ever seen on her face. Then, the heavy terrace latch clicked. The brass door swung wide, and standing beneath the doorway was Arthur Startling, the most ruthless member of the executive board. His face was twisted into a cold, triumphant smirk, and in his leather-gloved hand, he held a thick, stamped confidential envelope. "A touching performance, Ms. Vance," Startling said, his voice dripping with malice. "Enjoy your little romance while it lasts. Because tomorrow morning, your fiancé goes to prison." The following morning at 9 o'clock, the executive boardroom felt less like a conference hall and more like a public execution chamber. A low, suffocating tension hung over the long mahogany table. 20 senior shareholders and board members sat in rigid silence under the glare of recessed lights, while the morning rain streaked relentlessly across the high windows. I sat at the far end, with Diana beside me. Her posture was straight as a steel spine, but beneath the dark fabric of her suit, I could feel the cold, rigid tension radiating from her body. Arthur Startling stood at the head of the room, savoring every second of the silence. With a theatrical flick of his wrist, he tossed a thick, cerulean folder across the polished wood. It slid to a halt directly in front of Diana. 3 days ago, Startling began, his voice ringing with rehearsed authority, the preliminary schematics for our green tech manufacturing division were leaked to our primary acquisition rival across town. Along with those files went our proprietary supply chain contracts. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Diana didn't flinch. "And what does this internal leak have to do with today's succession hearing, Arthur?" Startling's eyes narrowed into a venomous smile. He tapped a remote, and the projector screen flared to life behind him. "Everything, Ms. Vance. Because the encrypted files were transferred from an internal terminal on the 45th floor at midnight last Thursday, using an executive security badge registered to your personal assistant. The IP logs match your penthouse office." My blood ran cold. Thursday was the night Diana and I had stayed late rehearsing our cover story. I had used her desktop to print our schedules while she stepped out to take a private call. Furthermore, Startling pressed on, projecting bank statements and a fake offshore routing slip, a wire transfer of $400,000 was initiated to an account tied directly to this young man's family medical trust. It appears our CEO's charming new fiancée was more interested in clearing his mother's hospital debts than honoring his vows. The room erupted. Shouts of indignation and outrage echoed off the glass walls. Board members glared at me with undisguised disgust, treating me like a common thief caught in the act. "This is completely fabricated," I said, standing up, my voice steady despite the hammer of my pulse against my ribs. "I have never touched those files, and I have never accepted a single dime outside of my salary." "The digital footprint doesn't lie, Mr. Vance-to-be," Startling sneered, crossing his arms. He turned his gaze toward Diana, his tone dropping into a poisonous, patronizing purr. "Diana, under the corporate bylaws, if you refuse to terminate and press charges against an employee caught in active industrial espionage, you forfeit all executive authority for gross negligence. The board will vote immediately to strip your succession rights." The entire room turned toward Diana. I looked down at her. Her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were entirely bloodless. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. She looked at the fabricated logs, then up into my eyes. In her dark, searching gaze, I saw an agonizing war raging between the legacy her grandfather had bled to build and the man standing beside her. If she defended me without proof, Startling would strip her of everything by noon. The 500 factory workers she had fought to protect would lose their livelihood, and her life's work would be dismantled before her eyes. Startling leaned forward, slamming his hand onto the table. "Make your choice, Diana. The criminal, or your company." The silence in that boardroom felt like the drop before a guillotine. I looked down at Diana. The woman who had carried the weight of an entire empire on her shoulders was looking up at me, her eyes pleading for a way out that didn't destroy us both. If she chose to defend me against fabricated evidence, Startling's coalition would trigger the emergency succession clause within the hour. She would lose the company her grandfather built with his bare hands, and 500 families would lose their jobs. I couldn't let my pride destroy her life's work. Without saying a word, I reached across the table, picked up Startling's fountain pen, and pulled the termination and non-disclosure agreement toward me. "Owen, don't," Diana whispered, her voice cracking, reaching out to stop my hand. Her fingers were trembling. I looked into her eyes, letting all the quiet love I had carried over these past weeks pour into my gaze. "You have a company to run, Diana. Don't let them take what's yours." With a steady hand, I signed my name across the bottom line. I set the pen down with a dull click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I gave Startling one last, unyielding look, turned on my heel, and walked out of the boardroom. I didn't take my coat. I didn't clear my desk. I simply took the elevator down to the ground floor and walked out the glass doors into the relentless, freezing downpour. What Startling didn't know, and what Diana had yet to discover, was that as a data analyst, I had noticed unusual server traffic routing through Startling's private IP 3 nights ago. Before walking into that trap this morning, I had spent 5 hours decrypting the server logs, unearthing the real paper trail. Startling had been paid $2 million by our competitors to orchestrate this exact takeover. I hadn't revealed it in the boardroom because Startling controlled the immediate vote. Instead, I left the encrypted flash drive inside the top drawer of Diana's private desk, sealed in an envelope beside a handwritten letter. Back on the 45th floor, as the boardroom emptied for the final shareholder ballot, Diana walked into her darkened office, her chest aching with an unbearable emptiness. She opened her center drawer and found the white envelope with her name written in my handwriting. Her hands shook violently as she broke the seal. Out dropped the black drive, labeled Startling's offshore logs, alongside 3 short sentences on folded stationery. Asterisk, I told you I was never acting. You don't need a fake fiancé to prove your worth, Diana. You are already everything your grandfather hoped for. Save your company. I'll always be proud of you. Asterisk. Tears spilled over her lashes, splashing onto the ink. The heavy realization hit her like a physical blow. I hadn't abandoned her. I had taken the public blame to buy her the exact evidence she needed to destroy Sterling once and for all. If you believe that true love is about protecting each other no matter the personal cost, share your thoughts in the comments below and share this story with someone who needs a reminder of what real devotion looks like. Far down the hall, the heavy mahogany double doors of the auditorium swung shut. The senior board members took their seats for the final vote to strip Diana of her title, Sterling already raising his glass in celebration. Diana wiped the tears from her face, gripped the drive in her fist, and sprinted toward the assembly before the final gavel could fall. 3 days later, I was standing in the quiet dust of my late father's old carpentry workshop behind my mother's house. The smell of cedar shavings and damp pine filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile glass towers 40 stories above the city. My mother was resting peacefully in the living room, her medical bills quietly settled by an anonymous benefactor I knew in my heart was Diana. I was running a piece of sandpaper over an unfinished oak table, trying desperately to scrub away the memory of her dark eyes and the lingering scent of jasmine that still haunted my thoughts. The small transistor radio on the workbench hummed with the evening news broadcast. The anchor's voice cut through the hum, in an unprecedented move during Vance Enterprises' emergency shareholder summit, CEO Diana Vance broadcast internal forensic logs exposing former board member Arthur Sterling's corporate espionage. Federal authorities took Sterling into custody earlier today. In a follow-up statement, Vance officially amended the century-old corporate charter, striking down the archaic succession clause and establishing complete independent control of the firm. I stopped sanding. A deep, quiet wave of relief washed over me. She had won. Her legacy was safe. Then, the crunch of tires on wet gravel broke the silence outside. I stepped toward the open barn doors, wiping sawdust from my hands onto a rag. A black sedan had pulled up to the driveway. The driver's door opened, and Diana stepped out into the twilight. She wasn't wearing her sharp designer armor or a tailored blazer. She was dressed in an oversized knit sweater and simple dark trousers, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. In her right hand, she carried a paper tray holding 2 cardboard takeout cups. She walked across the damp gravel, stopping just outside the threshold of the workshop. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. The only sound was the wind stirring the leaves in the yard. "You're a very difficult man to track down, Owen," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight, nervous tremor I had never heard in a boardroom. "You shouldn't be here, Diana," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "The press is watching your every move. You won. You have your company." "I don't care about the cameras," she whispered, stepping past the threshold into the warm glow of the workshop light. She set the coffee tray onto the wooden bench. "And the company wasn't a victory. Walking into that 45th floor on Monday morning and seeing your empty desk, that was the worst defeat of my life." She took 2 slow steps toward me, looking up into my eyes with an honesty that took my breath away. "You sacrificed your reputation to save my family's name," she said, tears brimming along her lashes. "No one has ever protected me like that. I spent years building walls so no one could hurt me, but you tore them down with a single spilled cup of coffee. I don't want a fake fiancé to satisfy a dead contract, Owen. I want you. As an equal. As my partner." A faint, teasing smile broke through her tears, echoing the very first morning our worlds collided. "Besides, you still owe me for that white suit." I couldn't help the quiet laugh that escaped my chest. I reached out, my hands trembling as I gently cupped her face, wiping a tear from her cheek with my thumb. "Where's my kiss?" I murmured softly. Diana rose onto her toes, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck, and brought her lips to mine. It was a kiss born not of contracts or corporate survival, but of hard-won devotion and unconditional love. If this story reminded you that true love is worth fighting for, please hit that like button, subscribe for more cinematic romance stories, and share this video with someone who believes in real connection. Thank you for listening, asterisk. In that quiet workshop, surrounded by the scent of sawdust and cedar, the noise of the city fell away completely. We didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in our lives, neither of us was standing alone.